Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Virgin Islands webinar. I'm going to give it a moment or two. We always find there's a couple stragglers coming in, so if you just be patient for another minute or so before we dive into the presentation. All right. Well, as we let the late coming attendees join in, um, welcome to our Virgin Islands cannabis licensing webinar. At Canada Advisors, we've been doing these for years now. One thing I'll note as we get going here is that as time has gone on, it's become less common to attend a webinar at its live time and much more common for people to log in and view it on our website. So consider yourselves the live studio audience for a recorded webinar that will get viewed over and over in the coming weeks. And I'll go ahead and dive in. We're going to be talking about the process of getting the cannabis licenses that are going to be offered in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we'll start with just a little bit of background on Canada Advisors. I know most of you who are attending know who we are, but just for those that don't, Canada Advisors, we're headquartered in Boulder, Colorado. And for the last 12 years, we've worked with hundreds of clients across the United States, Canada, Europe, Guam, Puerto Rico, as they've started their cannabis licenses and gotten up and running. Here is a timeline of some of our milestones dating back to Boulder Kind Care, which was our founding partner's first dispensary in Boulder back in 2009. And you can see all the wins there as we've gone through the years helping people get their licenses. By way of introduction, I'm Bob Wagoner. I'm the Vice President of Business Development here at Canada Advisors. I've been in business for 30 plus years now, with over 20 of those years at the executive level in both public and private companies. I've now been with Canada Advisors for 9 years, just almost done with 9 years. During that time, I have worked with hundreds of clients, personally worked in 36 US states as well as internationally. And one of the things I enjoy is after working closely with a client and getting their license and getting them up and running, traveling and visiting these businesses and remembering what it took to get there. And I can say I'm very excited about doing that in the Virgin Islands at some point. So let's get into it. The Virgin Islands. Although medical cannabis has officially been legal in the U.S. Virgin Islands since January of 2019, there have been some unique challenges to setting up the logistics of opening a supply chain and distribution, mostly centered around the fact that the Virgin Islands are a series of islands separated by federal water. So just like in the US, there's no interstate trade that crosses state boundaries, you'd be crossing a federal boundary as you went island to island. So that delayed some of the logistics. And I'm going to go through a time frame here of the process. Way back in December of 2014, cannabis was officially decriminalized when the legislature voted 14-0 to override the governor's line item veto within the budget that changed the penalties for cannabis. So officially, decriminalization dates all the way back to 2014. And then in January of 2019, the governor signed the Medical Cannabis Patient Care Act, allowing for limited use of medical cannabis. And even though at that time an outline was created, that's when they began running into logistical problems that were unique to the U.S. Virgin Islands. And as they worked on that, even though, in most states you see the medical cannabis get approved, a medical cannabis program get in place, and then they legalize adult use. But because of the delays that were encountered, Virgin Islands did something unique. They expanded the legalization of adult use before they ever rolled out a program. So that was December 30th of 2022. And then finally, May of this year, the governor approved the proposed regulations that were set forth by the Office of Cannabis Regulations, allowing for the licensing process to proceed. And that's where we're at. So first, let's get into the types of licenses. And you'll notice on this page, I don't have micro cultivation because the Virgin Islands will have licenses and they'll have permits. And the licenses, what they allow you to do and how you acquire them are different than the permits. So I've separated them and I'll get into permits in a minute. But as far as licenses go, there'll be cultivation. And a cultivator may cultivate up to 1,000 flowering plants at a time and have no more than 3,000 immature plants. A manufacturer is allowed to process, test, package, label, store, sell, and transport, and here's part of the key of the logistics, on the same island. Dispensary is allowed to store, sell, purchase cannabis products, and again, transfer on the same island. So one of the things they've done logistically is set this up in silos so that the three main islands have full supply chains. And then if people from the smaller islands want to travel to the bigger islands, that's where they'll have to acquire their cannabis. In addition to those three licenses, there's a testing facility, self-explanatory, and a research and development license, which is allowed to do a variety of things, including the cultivating, purchasing, selling, and transferring of cannabis, but for the purpose of testing. There will be a limited number of licenses, and it's broken down by island, as mentioned, so that each of the major islands has its own supply chain. St. John's is going to have up to 5 cultivation licenses and 3 dispensary licenses. St. Croix, 15 licenses and 7 dispensary licenses. And St. Thomas, 15 cultivation, 7 dispensary. And that, that's a healthy number of licenses, but it's not going to saturate the market. So I think they've really done a good job here of setting this up so that these licensees can be successful. So these licenses are going to be issued on a merit-based process. And that's something that we're not seeing as common anymore. Many states have shifted to qualified lotteries or outright lotteries. But this is a good old-fashioned merit-based application process where they've set up a list of information that each applicant is required to submit. They're going to score them, and those with the highest scores will win the licenses. And they've also made it clear that even in the absence of competition, if they don't get 15 cultivation licenses in a place where there's 15 licenses, they can still fail you if your application does not meet their requirements. Application requirements. Now, it's slightly different for each type of license, but this is an overview. And when I say slightly different, the operating plans are specific to each type of license. But it's got a list of meet or exceed requirements and then competitively scored requirements. The meet or exceed are pretty standard. It's the fingerprint and background check, your business formation documents, your proof of residency. They do get pretty specific about source of funds. So this is something where you're really going to want to show that you have access to funds as part of your application. Possession of the property, a detailed diagram of the property, emergency response plan. Those are all required. And then they're going to competitively score your business plan, your operations plan, the suitability of the facility and premise, the employee training plan, security and record keeping, product safety and labeling, emergency plan, and your social equity plan. So that's where the points are. The way it's broken down, and I did this for the cultivation, but it's the same for the other applications. It's just the operation plan is focused on that business type. There's a business plan, 150 points. The operations plan, 150 points. Suitability of facility is 150 points. Training plan, 50. Security record keeping, 150. Product safety plan, 150. Emergency plan, 50. And this is important, social equity, 150. And I'll get into the qualifications of social equity on a future slide, but that's 1,000 points. And when we work with clients, we are adamant about trying to get every single point. We know from experience, these licenses are often won or lost by a fraction of a point. The difference between number 15 that gets a license and number 16 that doesn't get a license could be half a point. So you have to go into this thinking, I need every single point to get a license. Here's an example of the cultivation business plan. And again, the breakdown is different for each license type, but you'll see that they're asking for a significant amount of information. They want the character, veracity, background, qualifications, relevant experience of the applicants, owners, investors, officers, and any other relevant business representatives. The business management experience of the representatives, including experience in cannabis agriculture, horticulture, and the extent of their involvement or ability to influence the day-to-day operations. So here they're looking for actual experience and job descriptions of those people. They need you to describe the long-term operations of the cultivation facility. They want to know the source and amount of equity that you have available. You have to prove that you have the financial feasibility to make it happen, and that includes a detailed financing plan. So you're going to have to show what it's going to cost to build your facility and that you have access to those funds. They want a startup timetable that provides an estimated time from license approval to opening your facility. And this is just one of the 7 or 8 plans, depending on your license type, that you have to submit. So again, this is a pretty intense application process. In addition to the types of licenses, there are several types of permits available. The first one being a micro cultivation permit. And a micro cultivator may cultivate no more than 50 flowering cannabis plants. So that's 50 for a micro compared to up to 1,000 for a license. And no more than 200 immature plants. So 200 compared to 3,000 for a licensed cultivator. And there's also 3 cannabis use permits. The first one is a temporary cannabis use permit, which allows for use of cannabis at a specific location for a specific limited time period. So this really appears to be for events, maybe concerts, where you're going to set aside a secured area for people who are over 21, where they can consume cannabis in a separate area. There's an adult use lounge, which allows for on-site consumption, again, per all of the rules set forth by the OCR, during the approved operational days and times. Meaning if you submit your operating plan and you're open from 10 in the morning till 11 at night, those would be your approved times. But the adult use lounge is more of a permanent setting. And then there's on-site consumption. This is interesting. This allows for on-site consumption, again, per OCR rules, at a licensed cultivation location. And I'll get into that a little bit more as I go through them. The difference with a permit and a license, I've gone through that the licensing application process here is going to be intense. The permit is not so much. It says in the rules, the OCR shall issue a permit to an applicant that meets the requirements contained in the Act and these rules. So they're implying there that if you're applying for any of these types of permits, so long as you meet the requirements, you will get a permit. Now, the only caveat to that is they say if there are more micro cultivation applicants than available permits, submissions will be scored with permits issued to applicants with highest scores. So that implies that they will limit the number of micro cultivation applicants, even though it's not spelled out yet. There's one wrinkle in there that I'll get to in a minute. So if you're applying for a permit, regardless of the type of permit you're applying for, you must use the form that the OCR provides. You will need to pass a site inspection, a background check, and pay your application fee. That's universal to all four permits. And then the micro cultivation permit is issued to a person or persons with a farming license from the Department of Agriculture at a designated location. So you must already have that farming license from the U.S. Virgin Islands Department of Agriculture. For a micro cultivation, you do have to submit an operational plan, and details of that operational plan are in the rules. Not quite as intense as the license application, but it's still asking for a lot of details about how you're going to run your cultivation operation. So that is a plan you're going to want to have completed in time to submit. To get a micro cultivation permit, you must have resided in the Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, for the past 3 years, with at least total years of cumulative residency. You cannot have a financial interest in any other cannabis license if you have a micro cultivation permit. The other permit types. In addition to the 4 requirements at the top of the last slide, for a use permit, it's issued to a person for a designated location. You know, one difference, it does say that the micro cultivation is issued to a person or group of people, and it specifically says use permits are to a single person. And it's a person with a U.S. Virgin Islands business license, and they have to submit and get a floor plan approved. For a temporary use permit, it's for a designated location for specific dates and times. And again, a concert, when you know the dates of that concert or event. You do have to submit an operational plan. For the use permits, the operational plans are heavily focused on the floor plan, the security around the smoking area, the process for ensuring everybody entering is 21 or more. And then they always have that catch-all of any other operational details requested by the OCR. For the temporary use permit, you do have to give proof that the property owner consents to the permit. Adult use lounge. Again, approval of the operation plan, very similar. It's about entrances, exits, security, age verification. And an adult use lounge the permit may be held by a licensed dispensary at an adjacent property. So it has to have a separate entrance, exit, and operate as a separate area. On-site consumption issued to licensed cultivators for use at their licensed premise. At the bottom here, I note that these licenses, these use licenses, are not a license to sell or distribute. You shall not sell, transfer, or distribute cannabis items within the premise. You shall take responsible measures to prevent unauthorized sale or transfer in and around the premise. So these are areas in which people can consume cannabis. You're in no way allowed to sell or offer it. So when it comes to the on-site consumption at a cultivator, it really appears that the OCR recognizes that some of the workers or visitors at these cultivation facilities, may be smokers or consumers of cannabis, and they want to ensure that there's a separate approved spot on that location for them to consume cannabis. So I just thought that was interesting. Okay, application timeline. They've released an estimated timeline on when to expect the application windows. And it starts just about a month from now. On November 4th, micro cultivator applications will open. Here's the wrinkle that I mentioned. It says here that micro cultivator applications will be a rolling application. But it also says in the regulations that if they receive more applications than available licenses, they'll shift to a competitive process. Well, it's very difficult to have a competitive process if you're not closing a window. So it appears that it's almost more of a first come, first serve if they're going to limit those licenses. So you're certainly, if you're interested in a micro cultivator permit, you're going to want to be ready to submit shortly after the window opens. You're going to want to make sure you submit a top-notch application that you get approval. It certainly seems that at some point they could stop accepting applications for micro cultivators. In November, we also get the window open for testing labs and research and development. And then in December, the fun part, we start getting dispensary applications. Window scheduled to open on December 20th and stay open for 45 days. January 7th, manufacturing, 45 days. May 2nd, cultivation. Now, this staggered approach is commonly used nowadays as states legalize. This is a little bit backwards. Typically, you'll see cultivation applications open first, followed by manufacturing, followed by dispensary, because that's the order in which you need the supply chain to develop. But with the issuing of micro cultivators beforehand, there will be some level of cultivation starting. And it could also be that the most difficult submission typically is cultivation. So they're giving more time for those applications to be assembled. It would be very difficult between now and December 20th to come up with all of your funding, all of your team, your property, if you were going to go for a full cultivation license. Residency requirements. Now, this is something that has been on the forefront of litigation within new applications. State after state has encountered court challenges to the residency requirement, and usually successful. The difference here is the U.S. Virgin Islands is a unincorporated territory of the United States. And as such, most of the federal commerce laws pertain, but not all of them. And I certainly wouldn't claim to be an expert on which federal commerce laws pertain to the U.S. Virgin Islands, such as the Dormant Commerce Clause. But I would have to imagine that the people who wrote these regulations were experts on that. So the best thing to do is make sure you meet the residency requirements. Let's expect that it will hold. And to meet that requirement, you have to currently be a resident and have resided for 10 of the last 15 years prior to applying. 51% must be owned by residents. So that's going to lead a lot of people who aren't residents to partner up with people who are residents. Social equity. Up to 150 points out of the 1,000 points are for social equity. To qualify as social equity, you must have a majority ownership. Now, in the regulations, it actually says 50.1, but 51% ownership by somebody who is adversely impacted. And that means you or a parent or a guardian was arrested or convicted for activities that the Act now finds legal. Now, some of these arrests or convictions may be extremely cut and dry. You just know that you qualify. Some of them will be on the edge. Would it be prosecuted under the current Act? If there's any question, we would highly recommend you contact an attorney within the Virgin Islands to have them review it, even submit a question to the OCR to get confirmation that you would qualify. The second way is sacramental use. If you are a registered member of faith faith-based groups certified as the OCR for sacramental use. You qualify as social equity. A female-owned entity. This is defined as a Virgin Islands-based entity, majority owned and controlled by female residents. And that's important. The majority female ownership have to be residents and have to have 51% ownership. Theoretically, you could have an ownership group of 10 people and 6 of them are women. So you would qualify, you would think, as female owned. But if only 4 of those women, but 2 of the men reside in the Virgin Islands, you'd also have majority ownership of residents, but it would not qualify as social equity because the 51% has to be owned by female residents. Same thing with service disabled veterans, majority owned by residents of the Virgin Islands classified as disabled veterans. Application licensing fees. What they've done is they've come up with the annual license fee for each license type. And that is the non-refundable application fee. It's also your first year's license if you win. So cultivation is dependent on how many plants you intend to have, but it's up to $10,000. If you're doing the full 1,000 flowering plants, it's a $10,000 non-refundable application fee. If you win, that is your first year's licensing fee, and then annually your renewal is $10,000. The only one that strays from that formula is dispensary, retail. They designated a $25,000 a year licensing fee for dispensaries. But because that's a little steep for a non-refundable application fee, they've said for retail, you pay $10,000 with your application. If you win, you pay the additional $15,000 for your first year's license, and then subsequently $25,000 a year for renewal. Testing lab R&D, $1,500. Permit fees. These are a little bit more reasonable. Micro cultivation, $1,000. Temporary use, $1,000. Consumption lounge, $1,500. On-site consumption, $1,500. And that's also your annual renewal. Okay, so what should you be working on now? If you are interested in pursuing one of these licenses, if you are not a Virgin Island resident, you should be looking for partners. And certainly that's something that we can help with from time to time. We do get people reaching out to us who have a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole thing. So to whatever extent we can make introductions, more than happy to do so. But there is a ton of work that needs to be done here. Even if you're just going to go for that micro cultivation permit, it requires a pretty significant operating plan, and you have to have that done in the next month for when that window opens. If you're going for one of the other licenses, you have a little bit more time, but it takes months to pull these applications together properly to ensure that everybody that you're pulling in is going to pass the background check, get all of their personal information, establish your proof of residency, your source of funds, identify your property, and then, of course, write all of the information that's required. So certainly we can help you with all of that. Just reach out if you have any specific questions. And then lastly, just want to note that at Can Advisors, we have a full spectrum of services, starting with pre-license strategy and foundational materials right through license application, through all different services for the middle of life, and then exit, mergers and acquisitions. So more than happy to help you out with any one of those. Now let me get over here and get Q&A going. All right, does anybody have any questions? There's a Q&A tab at the top. And let me go in chat and see if there's anything in the chat. Okay, not seeing anything there. I'll give it a couple minutes here. So, in closing, depending on whether you're going for a license or a permit, there's some genuine opportunity here, but something that is going to require a lot of work and effort to pursue. The best guess timelines. Not sure. I see Greg is asking about timelines getting pushed. One thing we almost always see delays in the programs, rarely ever see it sped up. And what we tell people is try to be prepared for what they're saying, but expect that it will get delayed. So I don't have any insight beyond the dates that have been proposed. Well, if there are no other questions, we'll wrap it up. We will be posting this webinar on our website. Usually takes a day or two for them to clean it up and post it on there. But feel free to come back, review it, share it with friends, and then of course reach out, email myself or info@CANA with any questions that you have. More than happy to help out and see what we can find for you. But thank you for joining. Appreciate it, and look forward to working together.